The lake shimmered beneath the morning sun, its quiet waters reflecting the wild pines and the wide sky above. It was the kind of place most folks in the late 1800s would pass without a second glance, for it sat at the far edge of an old American settlement where stories were whispered more often than written down. To the Apache girl who stood on its banks, however, this place was more than just a patch of land. It was a chance to begin again. She carried the weight of her people's past on her shoulders. Yet she also held a vision of something new, something lasting. The house she planned to build by the lake was not only a home but a symbol of her determination to carve a life out of soil that had witnessed both loss and survival. The villagers nearby had watched her with mixed feelings. Some saw in her a reminder of old battles and fading frontiers. Others, more quietly, admired her strength. For it was not common in those days to see a young woman, let alone an Apache, lifting timber, digging trenches, and stacking stones with her own hands. Yet she worked without complaint, her braid swinging behind her as steady as the swing of her hammer. Each strike echoed across the valley, as if announcing that she belonged here no matter what anyone thought. Life in that old village was slow and rooted in simple things: horses tied to fence posts, children running through dusty streets, the ringing of the blacksmith's hammer from dawn till dusk. Folks were bound by the land, their days governed by planting, herding, or hauling water. And while the settlement looked peaceful from a distance, it carried undercurrents of fear and suspicion, especially toward outsiders. For all their talk of community, people often guarded their hearts, wary of what lay beyond their own fences. That was why the girl's presence stirred so much unease. She was neither fully inside their world nor entirely outside of it, and that unsettled the fragile balance the village tried so hard to keep. Still, she pressed on with her dream. Every board she raised, every nail she drove, was a step closer to independence. She chose to build close to the water, believing the lake would provide both food and peace. The air there was cooler, touched by the scent of pine and the whisper of reeds swaying in the breeze. She told herself the lake would guard her, even as the memories of hardship pressed in on her. But nature, while beautiful, also held secrets buried deeper than anyone suspected. One afternoon, while working near the old wooden bridge that stretched across the narrow bend of the lake, she noticed something strange. The bridge had stood for decades, weather-beaten yet strong enough to carry wagons and riders. But the earth beneath it seemed unsettled, as though the ground itself wanted to speak. She had heard stories from elders about how water sometimes revealed truths the land tried to hide, and curiosity tugged at her spirit. With her shovel in hand, she began to dig at the soft soil near the bridge's edge, brushing aside layers of earth that had been undisturbed for years. The sound of her digging drew the attention of a rancher riding by. He slowed his horse and called out, his voice carrying over the still water. Folks often kept their distance from her, yet there was something in his tone that carried more concern than judgment. She didn't answer right away, intent on the ground beneath her boots. Something pale had begun to surface, shapes that didn't belong to the soil. Her pulse quickened as she knelt, brushing away dirt with trembling hands. The rancher dismounted and came closer, the creak of his saddle fading into silence. Together they stared into the shallow pit. There, half buried under the bridge's shadow, lay a sight that neither expected. The outlines grew clearer with each sweep of earth rows of small, sun-bleached remains, hidden for longer than anyone could recall. The girl froze, her breath caught between disbelief and dread. The rancher whispered a wordless prayer, for the ground had yielded not treasure, but a memory darker than the lake's still waters. The discovery stirred something old in the air, something that made the pine trees seem to lean closer and the wind fall still. It was as if the land itself had been waiting for someone brave enough to uncover what lay beneath. And though the girl had only wished to build a home by the lake, she now found herself standing on the edge of a story much larger than her own. She tightened her grip on the shovel, her eyes locked on the strange, silent remains. Behind her, the lake shimmered as peacefully as ever, hiding the weight of history beneath its calm face. Ahead, the bridge stood unchanged, its timbers creaking softly, as if mocking her discovery. The rancher shifted uneasily, his gaze darting between her and the bones. He seemed to want to speak, but stopped, as though words themselves might carry consequences too heavy to bear. The village, she knew, would have no choice but to reckon with what she had unearthed. But whether they would welcome the truth or bury it once more was a question no one yet dared to answer. And as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows over the bridge and the lake, the girl realized her new home would not just be a place of shelter, it would stand at the center of a mystery that could either bind the community together or tear it apart forever. Her house was not yet finished, her dream not yet secured. But now, with the ground opened and the past staring back at her, she could feel the story shifting. What she had found under the bridge would change everything. The question was not what she would build by the water, but what secrets the land would force her to face before the walls of her new life could stand. And as night fell, she could not shake the feeling that she was not the only one watching. The lake was quiet, yet the silence felt heavier than before. Something in the shadows of the bridge seemed to whisper, waiting, as though the true story had only just begun. The rancher stood still, his hat shadowing his face as he stared into the shallow pit. The girl could hear his horse pawing at the dirt behind him, uneasy, as if it too sensed something unnatural. She pressed her lips together, unsure whether to keep digging or cover the remains back up. A part of her wanted to pretend she hadn't seen it, to return to hammering her boards and lifting her beams, but the sight was burned into her mind now. She knew that once something like this came into the open, it would not stay hidden for long. The rancher finally spoke, his voice low and careful. "This ground's been holding secrets longer than either of us been alive," he said. His words hung heavy in the cooling air. He didn't tell her what to do, and she could sense he was torn. He was a man who had lived by the rules of the land, by cattle and fences. But here was something that did not fit neatly into any rule. She rose slowly, brushing dirt from her hands, and looked back toward the village in the distance. Smoke from evening cook fires curled up from chimneys. People there would soon be gathering at tables, sharing food, laughter, and stories. Yet none of them knew what lay here under the bridge, resting silently until her shovel had disturbed it. She felt a cold shiver run down her arms. Her thoughts drifted back to the elders' words from long ago. They had spoken of a time when the lake was not a place of peace, but of conflict. When wagons had come rolling across the land and not everyone had walked away alive. She had listened quietly to those stories as a child, never imagining she would one day see proof with her own eyes. Now, standing over the shallow pit, she wondered if the earth itself had chosen her to uncover what was hidden. The rancher shifted uneasily. "You best not stay here alone," he muttered, though he did not step closer. His horse let out a low snort, and he tugged at the reins, keeping the animal steady. "Word'll spread if folks catch wind of this." He left the thought unfinished, but she knew what he meant. The village was not kind to those who stirred old ghosts. People feared what they could not explain, and sometimes they turned their fear into anger. She glanced at him, measuring whether he could be trusted. He seemed sincere, yet she also knew ranchers had their own burdens to carry, land disputes, cattle rustlers, debts. Would he protect her if the town decided to turn its suspicion toward her? She could not be sure. Instead of answering, she bent to her work again, digging carefully around the edges of the remains. She wanted to know how far they stretched, how many lay buried here. The rancher stayed a few minutes longer, then finally mounted his horse. Before he rode off, he called out, "Don't let the dark catch you here." She watched him disappear into the line of pines, the steady clop of his horse's hooves fading into silence. As twilight deepened, the girl stayed by the bridge. She had not yet decided what she would do with what she found. Her house by the lake still stood unfinished, its beams reaching skyward, like ribs of a skeleton waiting for flesh. The thought struck her that maybe she was not building on solid ground at all. It's on top of something that wanted to be remembered. The following morning, she woke to the sound of wagons rolling in the distance. She stepped outside her temporary shelter, a canvas tent pitched near the lake hand, squinted toward the settlement. Life moved as usual. Men drove cattle down the main road. Children trailed behind, their laughter ringing faintly through the crisp air. Women carried baskets to the trading post, their skirts brushing the dusty path. It looked peaceful, yet she knew that peace was a thin layer, just like the soil that had covered the remains beneath the bridge. She fetched water from the lake and studied her reflection. Her eyes looked older than she remembered, weighed down by what she had uncovered. She dipped the bucket and turned away, determined to keep working on her home. If she let fear stall her, then she would never have a place of her own. Still, the thought of the hidden pit pressed into her mind with every step she took. Later that day, while hauling lumber, she heard voices carrying across the water. 2 boys were playing near the bridge, skipping stones. She froze, her heart racing. If they wandered too close, they might stumble upon the loose earth where she had dug. She called out, her tone sharp enough to send them scattering. They ran back toward the village, leaving her standing alone again. But she knew this could not last. Children had a way of telling everything they saw, and soon others might come looking. That night, as the moonlight shimmered across the lake, she lit a small fire near her tent. The wind carried the scent of pine and smoke, and the flames flickered like restless spirits. She sat quietly, listening to the night sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of branches, the occasional splash of a fish breaking the lake's surface. But beneath those sounds was another silence, heavier than the rest, pressing on her ears. It was the silence of the pit beneath the bridge, waiting for her to return. She remembered how the rancher had looked when he saw the remains, his jaw tight, his hands fidgeting at his sides. He knew something, she realized. Maybe not the whole truth, but enough to make him wary. Perhaps his family had passed down stories the kind men only whispered when the lamps burned low. If that was true, then she needed to hear them, for she could not carry this mystery alone. The following days passed in a blur of labor. She hauled stones for the foundation, cut planks for walls, and set posts deep into the ground. From time to time, villagers passed by. Some offered polite nods, others narrowed their eyes, wondering why she toiled so close to the water when better ground lay elsewhere. No one asked outright, but she could feel their unease. And always, the bridge stood in the distance, its shadow stretching across the lake like a mark of warning. One evening, just as the sun bled into the horizon, the rancher returned. He dismounted slowly, tying his horse to a nearby post, and walked toward her with the measured steps of a man carrying something on his conscience. She set down her hammer and waited. "You've been digging," he said simply. She nodded, her face steady. He hesitated, then added, "My father used to speak of this place. Said it wasn't just a lake, it was a crossing. Folks came through here long ago, but not all of them made it." He paused, his eyes drifting toward the bridge. "He never told me details, only that the land remembers, even if men choose to forget." Her heart quickened. "And now we've remembered it," she said softly. The rancher looked at her, his expression troubled. "Be careful with what you've uncovered. The village. They don't take kindly to stirring up the past. Some things they'd rather leave buried." She wanted to ask him more, but before she could, he mounted his horse again. "Just be careful," he repeated, then rode off into the fading light. She stood there long after he was gone, the hammer heavy in her hand. She thought of her nearly finished house, of the beams rising against the sky, and of the pit beneath the bridge that now felt like a wound opening wider each day. She knew the rancher was right, some in the village would rather ignore the truth. But she also knew the land had chosen her, and she could not turn away. That night, the wind shifted, carrying with it a sound that made her skin prickle. It was faint, almost like a whisper, rising from the direction of the bridge. She held her breath, straining to hear, but the sound faded into the rustle of the pines. Still, her heart pounded. Whether it was her imagination or something else, she could not tell. All she knew was that the secret beneath the bridge would not stay silent forever. And as she lay down to rest, staring at the canvas above her, she realized her house by the lake would never be just a home. It was becoming the center of a story that was only beginning to unfold, one that would bind her to the land in ways she had not yet begun to understand. The following week brought a restless kind of silence to the settlement. Word had traveled faster than the Apache girl expected. She hadn't spoken a single word about the pit beneath the bridge, but whispers carried like dust in the wind. Children told their parents she had been digging too close to the water. A trader muttered that he saw her carrying bones in her hands, though she never had. Soon, half the town had a version of the story, each stranger than the last. When she walked into the trading post to buy nails and lamp oil, the room went quiet. Men leaned on barrels of grain and watched her from the corner of their eyes. Women hushed their children and pulled them closer. She pretended not to notice, placing her few coins on the counter, but the weight of their stares pressed down on her shoulders. The shopkeeper cleared his throat nervously, giving her change with shaking fingers. By the time she stepped back into the sunlit street, her chest ached with the strain of holding herself steady. That night, she returned to her half-built house by the lake, but her work felt heavier. She swung the hammer, but each strike carried not just the sound of wood but the echo of the villagers' silence. The house had been her dream, a place to stand tall on her own, but now it was becoming a mark that set her apart even more. She wondered if finishing it would make her stronger or only draw the village's suspicion. Closer, the rancher returned often, though never for long. Sometimes he brought small things she needed: an iron nail, a coil of rope, or a jug of water. He didn't say why he helped, but his eyes told her he felt tied to the secret as much as she did. Yet, even he warned her gently not to stir up more than she could handle. "This place has a memory," he said one evening, his voice low as he looked at the bridge. "But not everyone's ready to face it." Her nights grew troubled. She dreamed of the pit beneath the bridge, of pale shapes rising from the soil, of whispers in a language she almost understood but not quite. Sometimes she woke with the sound of creaking wood in her ears, as though the bridge itself were speaking. Each time she went to the water's edge in the morning, the stillness seemed too deep, as if the lake held more than reflections. One morning she noticed tracks near the pit. They weren't her own or the rancher's. The earth showed the mark of boots, heavy and careless, as if someone had come searching. Panic pricked at her. She brushed leaves across the disturbed soil. But the truth was clear. Someone else knew. In town that afternoon, she overheard two men at the blacksmith's forge. They spoke low, but she caught enough. "Something's buried out by the bridge," one said. "Always figured that land wasn't right. Now the girl's gone and dug it up." The other spat into the dust. "Ain't nothing good comes from turning over graves. If she don't leave it alone, there'll be trouble." Her hands tightened around the sack she carried. They were not just suspicious now, they were angry. Fear spread faster than truth, and she was standing in the middle of it. The rancher seemed to sense her worry. He came by at dusk, leading his horse by the reins, and listened as she told him about the tracks near the pit. His face darkened. "They'll come looking," he said. "Once men think there's a secret, they won't rest until they've torn it wide open." She felt the truth of his words. The village had lived for years pretending the land was quiet, that nothing slept beneath it. But now that silence had cracked, and curiosity mixed with fear was a dangerous thing. While this weighed heavy, another thread began to tug at her. An older woman from the village, someone who had never spoken to her before, came one evening with a basket of bread. She stood by the water's edge, her face lined with years of worry. "I knew your mother," the woman said softly. "Long ago, before the troubles." The girl froze, for no one in the village had ever spoken of her family with kindness. The woman's eyes glistened as she placed the basket down. "Some things buried ought to stay that way, child. But some things need remembering too." She left without saying more, disappearing into the twilight. The girl stared at the bread long after the woman had gone, her heart pounding with questions. Did the woman know about the pit? Did she carry her own memories of what the land held? That night she lay awake, turning the woman's words over and over. Perhaps there were others in the village who knew more than they admitted. People who had carried silence for too many years. Meanwhile, her house by the lake neared completion. The walls stood strong, the roof half finished, and the chimney stacked with stones she had carried herself. Yet each board seemed heavier than the last, as if the weight of the past was pressing down on her work. Children lingered at a distance, watching as she built, daring each other to step closer before running back toward town. The whispers grew louder, some saying she had dug up cursed ground, others saying she guarded hidden treasure. Either way, the house became a mark on the horizon, a place everyone talked about but few dared approach. Then came the evening when lanterns flickered across the far side of the lake. She stood by her doorway and counted 3, maybe 4, moving slowly near the bridge. Shadows bent and crouched, men digging at the soil she had tried to cover. Her heart thundered in her chest. She wanted to shout, to stop them, but she bit her lip. If they uncovered the remains fully, there would be no hiding the truth. The rancher appeared from the trees, his horse left behind. He had seen the lanterns, too. Together they stood in the dark, watching as the men unearthed what should have been left in silence. The sound of shovels cutting earth carried clearly across the still water. Then came the sharp clatter of bone against metal. One of the men cursed. Another muttered something she could not hear. They kept digging. The girl gripped the rancher's arm, her breath catching. The secret was no longer hers alone. The land had spoken to others now, and there would be no turning back. By dawn, the men were gone, leaving the pit wider and deeper. She and the rancher crept across the bridge to see the damage. Bones lay scattered, some small, some larger, their pale shapes stark against the churned soil. The sight twisted her stomach. She had uncovered a whisper of the past. But these men had ripped it open. The rancher swore under his breath, his hand tightening into a fist. "This will spread through the town like wildfire," he said. "By sundown, everyone will know what lies here." She knelt by the disturbed earth, brushing soil from a fragment with trembling fingers. The weight of it pressed into her chest. These were not just bones. They were voices, silenced long ago, now pulled into the light. And with them came questions the village had long avoided. Back at her house, she tried to keep working, but her hands shook too much to hold the hammer steady. Each sound from the road made her head snap up, expecting a crowd to come storming with accusations. She felt the thin line between belonging and exile tightening, and so the main conflict stood before her. Wide as the lake itself. She wanted to build a life, to stand strong by the water. But the land she had chosen carried memories the village did not want to face. The people were watching her, waiting to decide if she was a danger or a keeper of truths they feared. The rancher stayed close, but even his presence could not shield her from the growing storm. As the sun set again, she looked at the bridge, its shadow stretching long over the water. She could almost hear it creak with the weight of untold stories. The bones beneath were no longer silent, and the village was no longer blind. Something was coming, and she could feel it in the stillness of the air. In the whispers of the pines, and in the restless water of the lake, the house by the lake would soon stand finished. But it was no longer just hers. It had become a mark of reckoning, a place where past and present met, and where the truth could no longer be buried. The days that followed were heavier than any the Apache girl had known. The village was no longer whispering. Men gathered outside the blacksmith's shop, their faces grim, speaking in sharp tones. Women at the well drew their buckets faster, their eyes darting to one another when she passed. Children no longer lingered at the lake. They were called home early, as if their parents feared the water itself. The house she had worked so hard to build was nearly finished now. The roof was patched with shingles she had cut by hand. The door was fitted to its frame, and the chimney reached above the beams like a sentinel. Yet instead of pride, she felt only the weight of watchful eyes. Every nail she drove seemed to echo across the valley, reminding the village that she was still there, standing on the edge of their world. Beside the lake that no one wished to speak of anymore, the rancher came often, though he was careful not to linger when others were watching. He brought her food some evenings and helped steady the ladder when she climbed to the roof. His silence told her more than his words that he feared for her, that he knew the village was tightening its circle and she was standing outside of it. Each time he left, he gave her a look that carried both warning and loyalty, though even he seemed unsure how far that loyalty could stretch. Then came the night of the meeting. The girl did not attend, but she could hear the rumble of voices across the open fields. The villagers had gathered at the church, lanterns glowing in the windows, the sound of raised voices carrying across the still night air. She sat by her fire, staring into the flames, her heart pounding at each burst of noise. She could not hear the words, but she knew she was the subject. They would not let the unearthed pit remain untouched. The rancher arrived late that night, his face shadowed with worry. "They're restless," he said. "Half of them want to fill the pit and forget it ever existed. The other half?" He paused, his jaw tightening. "The other half want answers. They think you brought this to light for a reason, that you know more than you're telling." She shook her head, fear and anger rising together. "I only wanted to build a home," she whispered. But even as she said it, she knew it was no longer that simple. The pit had spoken louder than her intentions. And now the whole village had heard. In the days that followed, men came to the lake. Not all at once, but in pairs or small groups, pretending to hunt or fish, though their eyes never left the ground near the bridge. She felt them watching her as she worked, felt their suspicion burning across the water. She tried to keep her hands steady, but her heart raced with every glance in their direction. The bridge creaked with the weight of their boots as they walked across it, pausing to look down into the shadows where the soil had been disturbed. At night, she no longer slept well. The wind carried sounds she could not explain, the steady beat of shovels striking earth, though no one was there, or the low groan of timbers bending when no wagon passed. Sometimes she thought she heard voices, faint and broken, rising from the direction of the pit. She would sit up in her tent, clutching the blanket around her shoulders, staring into the dark. The lake, once her place of peace, shimmered like a mirror hiding something beneath. The old woman returned one evening, her eyes tired but sharp. She stood by the half-finished door and said quietly, "The ground remembers, child. It always does. What you've found, it is not just bones. It is a story men have tried to bury for too long." The girl wanted to ask what story, but the woman shook her head, refusing to say more. "Be careful," she whispered, and left as quickly as she had come. Her figure fading into the trees. The rancher, too, grew more uneasy. "They'll come in numbers soon," he warned. "They can't decide whether to fear you or follow you, but either way, they won't let this lie much longer." His words chilled her. She felt the tension building. The same way the air thickens before a storm, the breaking point came when the pit was found open again. She had covered it carefully, laying branches and soil across the disturbed ground, but someone had returned in the night. The soil was dug deeper now, the bones scattered further. Whoever had done it had not cared for secrecy. They wanted the remains to be seen. The girl fell to her knees, her hands trembling as she touched the cold fragments. She realized then that the secret was no longer a secret at all. It was a wound laid bare, one the whole village could not ignore. By the next morning, a crowd gathered at the lake. Men, women, even children came, standing in a circle around the bridge. They spoke in hushed tones, some crossing themselves, others shaking their heads. The girl stood apart, her chest tight, as their eyes flicked toward her. One man demanded answers, his voice loud enough to carry over the water. "Why'd you dig here? Why'd you stir this up?" His words burned with accusation, though she had no answer that would calm them. The rancher stepped forward, placing himself between her and the crowd, but his presence only stirred more voices. Some shouted that the remains should be reburied at once. Others cried that the truth should be told. No one agreed, but all of them looked at her as though she held the choice. The girl's pulse thundered in her ears. She wanted to speak, but the weight of their eyes silenced her. Instead, she looked at the pit, at the pale bones lying against the dark soil, and felt the ground hum beneath her feet. The land itself seemed to be waiting, pressing her toward a choice she was not ready to make. That night the lake was restless. The wind tore across its surface, sending ripples against the shore. The trees bent and moaned as though warning of what was to come. She sat by her fire, staring at the bridge, the glow of her flames reflected in the black water. The rancher stayed nearby, silent but steady, while the girl felt the weight of the entire village pressing down on her. From beyond the trees, she knew the climax was drawing near. The village wanted resolution. The land wanted remembrance. And she was caught between them, standing in the place where history refused to stay buried, as the moon rose high. Casting silver light over the bridge, she rose to her feet, clutching the shovel that had first uncovered the truth. The night was silent, but her heart beat like a drum. Something was coming, whether from the village, the land, or the past itself. She did not yet know. But the air was heavy with it, and she felt certain that once it broke, nothing in the settlement, by the lake or beyond, would ever be the same again. The first light of dawn spread over the lake, painting the water with streaks of gold, and the air carried that cool stillness that comes after a storm. The village was quiet, almost reverent, as if it too had been holding its breath through the trials of the past weeks. By the bridge, the Apache girl stood with her hands resting on the wooden rail, looking down at the water that once hid secrets no one dared to speak of. Her house by the lake stood behind her, not just a shelter now, but a symbol of survival, truth, and courage. What had started as a simple dream of building a home had turned into a journey that shook the village to its roots. The bones discovered beneath the bridge had revealed the long-buried truth of broken trust, its old crimes, and the lives of those forgotten. Yet, standing in that place, she did not feel haunted anymore. Instead, she felt a kind of peace, as if the spirits had finally been heard, and their silence could now rest. The villagers, who once doubted her, now saw her with respect that went deeper than words. She had not only unearthed the truth, but it also brought them closer as a community by the lake. Elders gathered in a circle, their weathered faces solemn, but lighter than before. They spoke of the importance of remembering, of passing stories down so that no wrong would ever again be hidden under silence. The rancher who had once doubted her courage stood nearby, tipping his hat as a quiet show of respect. He had seen her bravery firsthand, seen her walk through fear without faltering, and he knew her spirit was stronger than most men he had ridden with. The children of the village now ran freely near the bridge without fear, yet their laughter chasing away the shadows that once clung to the place. Life had begun to return to its rhythm, though never again would the lake be just a quiet body of water. It was now a keeper of memory. Inside her home, the girl kept a simple wooden box where she placed tokens she found near the bridge, small reminders of those who had been wronged and were now remembered. A carved bead, a rusted nail, a smooth stone. To her, they were not just objects. They were voices that had once been silenced. She told the children about them, weaving lessons into her stories, teaching that the truth might be buried, but it always finds a way back into the light. The house she built became more than a dwelling. It became a gathering place, a hearth where families came to share food, talk of the day's work, and recall the lessons learned from the trial they all endured. The fire in her home burned not only for warmth, but also as a symbol of healing. The lake itself seemed to change with the seasons. In the spring, it reflected the blossoms of wildflowers and promised new beginnings. In the summer, its waters cooled those who worked the fields. In the fall, the trees mirrored their colors in its stillness. And in the winter it stood frozen, as if guarding its own silence. Yet every season carried a reminder of what lay beneath its surface and what had been uncovered. The people no longer feared it. They honored it. They saw the bridge as a marker of courage, of a girl who faced shadows and brought them to light. The villagers often spoke of her with a mix of awe and gratitude. They remembered how the truth had nearly torn them apart, but ultimately bound them closer together. Families who had once lived side by side but barely spoke now gathered as one. Old feuds were put to rest, replaced with shared meals and laughter. They understood that life in an old American village was never easy, but it was made bearable through unity, and that unity had been restored because of her. Even travelers who passed through the settlement near the lake carried tales of the Apache girl who built a house by the water and uncovered the secret beneath the bridge. Word spread to other villages and ranches, and people came not only to trade but also to hear her story. In time, her tale became a legend told by firelight. A story of truth, resilience, and the courage to face what others chose to bury as seasons turned. She would sometimes walk alone to the edge of the bridge at dusk. The setting sun would cast a glow across the lake, and in that quiet moment, she would close her eyes and feel the weight of the past and the freedom of the present. She did not see herself as a hero. She saw herself simply as a daughter of her people, someone who wanted a home and found herself protecting more than just four walls. What shocked everyone was not just what she had found under the bridge, but the strength she showed in carrying that burden for all of them. The story's ending was not one of forgetting, but of remembering with strength. The house stood strong by the lake, its windows catching the morning light, its door always open to those who needed comfort or truth. The bridge remained weathered but steady, a path that carried both the memory of sorrow and the promise of hope. The village lived on, not untouched by the past, but wiser because of it. And through it all, the girl remained at the heart of it. Her life woven into the fabric of the place she called home. She had built her house with her own hands. But what she truly built was a bond among people, a reminder that the land holds memories, and that sometimes the bravest act is to face them. The whispers that once circled the lake turned into songs of respect, sung by children who would never know the fear of silence, only the power of truth. As the firelight flickered in her home each evening, the villagers knew they had been changed forever. The Apache girl's courage became a light for all of them. A story that would be told long after the lake had mirrored 1,000 sunsets and the bridge had weathered 100 storms.